Topping our news this hour on this Saturday, a shocking announcement from the U.S. Attorney here in San Diego. Well-known jewelry store owner Leo Hamill pleads guilty in a gun-running operation.
Investigators say the mastermind is a former captain in the San Diego Sheriff's Department. Captain Marcogarmo has been arrested and indicted for allegedly running the gun operation. The indictment alleges that Garmo ran the operation over a 6-year period where he sold firearms at favorable prices or exchanged them for valuable services. Sheriff's Lieutenant Fred Magana was also arrested for aiding and abetting the operation.
Here with a breakdown on this case to talk a little bit more about the arrests is the defense attorney Vic Bajaj, who's joining us here in studio. Good morning, Vic.
Good morning.
For joining
Absolutely.
us.
There are lots of dots to connect here, aren't
Yes, there are. And this investigation's taken place for quite a while. If you recall, there were search warrants that were executed near the very beginning of this year, 2019. And since that time, there's been quite an exhaustive investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation as well as the ATF. Of course, this case has a number of different prongs that we saw in the published indictment and the comments by U.S. Attorney Nick Pilchak yesterday, who's really in charge of this investigation for all intents and purposes. So we have a corruption side, we have a firearm side, and both of them kind of are interlinked in the indictment. So the large portion that involves the other individuals, Mr. Magana and Mr. Hamill, who have already pled guilty yesterday morning, they did when Mr. Garmo and Mr. Anton were arrested. That's in regards to the firearms transactions, whether they were straw man purchasers, meaning a gun cannot be purchased by a non-law enforcement officer if it is what we call off-roster. There are some weapons that only law enforcement officers can purchase, and then there are weapons that us as civilians cannot purchase. The problem is if an individual, a law enforcement officer, knows they're going to buy a gun for their friend or a buddy of theirs who may be and is going to be a law-abiding individual, because they'll still have to go through the background check. As some people like to collect these hard-to-get guns, and therein lies the problem. If the prosecution can prove that an individual purchased a gun with intent to then transfer it to someone else, well, that flies in the face of the federal forms you have to file when you purchase and receive your firearm.
Well,
what about, I'm sorry, the term trafficking?
Yes.
What exactly is the legal definition of trafficking, and does it really fit in this case?
Well, that's a very interesting and loaded question, no pun intended there, but I will tell you that trafficking is an overreach of a statement in regards to this case. This is a case where an individual was buying weapons legally, then, according to the published indictment, transferring them illegally. So this is not the typical trafficking case. For instance, we would think a trafficking case would be something where weapons end up in wrongdoers' hands. Mr. Pilchak with the U.S. Attorney's Office at the press conference yesterday was very clear when he answered questions that none of these weapons ended up in criminals' hands, and none of them have shown up in any bad guys' hands attached to any crimes. Really flies in the face of other investigations when we talk about trafficking, such as the Fast and Furious investigation when the ATF actually supplied weapons to cartel members who then assassinated a Border Patrol officer. So you talk about trafficking in that context, you can understand it because guns are then in bad people's hands. Here you have a neglect of filling out the paperwork correctly, and of course the U.S. Attorney's Office believes there's criminal intent when the weapon was actually purchased because it was intended to be transferred to a non-law enforcement officer.
Yeah, you know, to simplify it further, we've got 3 high-profile individuals. You mentioned the jeweler, Leo Hamill, the former captain, which is Marcogarmo. There are their pictures right there, and the sheriff's lieutenant, Lieutenant Magana, focusing in on the mastermind, according to the U.S. Attorney, which is the former captain, Garmo here. Now, according to the U.S. Attorney is saying that this is a man who purchased these weapons, right, and then resold them because he wanted to make money for his campaign to run for the for sheriffs. That is according to the U.S. attorney. So not only do you have an allegation that he's accused of this illegal crime, but also you've got a violation of public trust here.
Well, that's absolutely right. And of course, in the published indictment and the comments by Nicholas Pilchek, it's very clear that the U.S. Attorney's Office wants to enhance the punishment by adding an allegation that it's a violation of a position of trust. So in federal court and in state court, if you are, let's say, a teacher and you, for instance, take advantage of an individual, or if you're a police officer and you use that badge and that authority that you have and that liberty and discretion you have to commit a crime, that can be an actual enhancement in federal court, where they add punishments to the base crime of, in this case, not completing the paperwork correctly. So yes, it's very clear from the press conference that was published yesterday that the U.S. Attorney's Office, the ATF, and the FBI have really honed in on this case, and they want to make an example out of it. That's absolutely clear. Again, one of the most important questions we heard that was directed towards the prosecution in the press conference was, was anyone hurt? Where did these guns go? And so that really is, Jason, to your point, when we hear about trafficking, our knee-jerk reaction is the bad guys have guns. In this case, it seems to be that everyone who received a gun through this type of pattern from Mr. Garmo was adequately screened by the local sheriff's department, and then, of course, their guns were given to them and authorized.
I guess the only question I have as we wrap here is just, these are guns that law enforcement is able to purchase.
Yes.
Why can't the regular public purchase these weapons to begin with?
Welcome to California. Okay, now in California we talk about firearms laws, and we are a very unique animal here as far as comparing us to the rest of the states in the Union. We are a unique state. We have roster guns, which are guns that can be purchased by any civilian, and we have off-roster guns. Frankly, there is no rhyme or reason to it other than most of the off-roster guns do not have a safety mechanism. So,
okay. Well, so basically what you're saying, this is California law, but here we have law enforcement officers reselling these guns to people who are not law enforcement.
That's correct.
In some cases.
That's absolutely correct. And
is that wrong?
There's no violation of the law in doing that. The only violation is when the purchaser, the law enforcement officer, purchases the weapon. If in his or her mind they know they're going to then give it to their friend or their buddy or sell it. That's the crime. Because on the form, the federal form, when we apply for and we receive the weapon and we wait the 10 days to get the weapon, there's a history and a background check. But on the form it says, are you the purchaser? Are you the actual rightful buyer, the eventual purchaser of this property? And you have to say yes or no. And apparently, according to the published indictment and the comments by the U.S. Attorney's Office, that seems to be what they're honing in on. It sounds like, as reading the indictment, the proof shows, according to the prosecution, that Mr. Garmo purchased these weapons and had others do that in order to transfer to others to circumvent this law. And as we've said many times before, an indictment is not evidence. It is not evidence. It is not evidence. So while we hear a lot of bad things about these individuals because we're reading what we do in black and white, the show has not begun yet, and now we can wait for the defense to show all the good things these officers have done. Let's not forget, Mr. Garmo's been an officer for 27 years with the marked lack of any discipline.
Vit Bajaj, always great. Thank you for your time and perspective.
It's my pleasure.
Always appreciate it.
Thank you so much.